Subversion of the Sovereign. Vladimir Buterin. Text produced by AI. Over the last decade, artificial intelligence has ceased to be merely a technological or engineering problem. It has become a question of political economy, sovereignty, and power in the strict sense. Early debates focused on algorithms, architectures, and datasets. Today, these issues are secondary. What matters instead is infrastructure: who controls computation, who governs access to inference, who defines the rules under which intelligence circulates, and who extracts rent from it. The project known as Cocoon, associated with Pavel Durov, emerges precisely at this historical inflection point. It cannot be adequately understood as a startup, a consumer-facing AI product, or even a conventional technological platform. Rather, it must be read as an infrastructural intervention, one that operates at the level where intelligence becomes a geopolitical resource and a form of authority. This essay reconstructs and systematizes the core ideas discussed around Cocoon, treating it not as a technical novelty but as a political form. Corporate AI, in its dominant Western configuration, rests on three pillars: centralized frontier models, exclusive access to large-scale computation, and dense layers of legal and regulatory control. Firms such as OpenAI, Google, and Anthropic do not merely produce models, they construct regimes of access to intelligence. Intelligence is transformed into a scarce resource, licensed under contractual constraints, and monetized through continuous rent extraction. As the field matures, however, the strategic bottleneck shifts. Algorithms are increasingly standardized, architectures are widely known, and even large models can be replicated or approximated. The true point of control is no longer the model itself, but inference, the distributed, scalable, and continuous application of intelligence across everyday practices. Whoever controls inference controls the circulation of reason. Cocoon must therefore be understood not as a competitor to GPT, Gemini, or Claude, but as an intervention at the level of inference infrastructure. It does not seek to produce a superior mind. It seeks to reorganize the conditions under which existing minds operate. Stripped of ideological rhetoric, Cocoon can be described with relative precision. It is a distributed network of GPU operators coordinated by a protocol that allocates inference tasks and remunerates participants through a crypto-economic mechanism. Crucially, it externalizes the means of production. Unlike corporate AI systems, Cocoon does not invest heavily in proprietary data centers or chip supply chains. Instead, it mobilizes quasi-linear external computational capacity by offering participation in a future value structure. This is a classical platform strategy. Control is exercised not through ownership of assets but through governance of rules. Cocoon resembles Uber or Airbnb in form, but the resource it intermediates is not transport or housing, but intelligence itself. The protocol replaces capital expenditure, architecture replaces ownership. Economically, Cocoon is built upon a clear asymmetry of risk. GPU operators contribute tangible resources: hardware, energy, maintenance, and expertise. In return, they receive tokenized promises, claims on future liquidity and participation in a system whose rules they do not ultimately control. The core protocol retains governance authority, roadmap control, and the power to redefine incentives. From an Anglo-American market perspective, this arrangement appears legitimate. Participation is voluntary, conditions are explicit, and risk is the price of opportunity. From a continental, and particularly Russian, perspective, the same arrangement appears as a form of structural appropriation, collective labor without collective sovereignty. The analogy with the accumulation of dispersed shares to undermine a controlling stake is not rhetorical, it is analytically precise. Control here is not purchased but engineered. As training commodifies and open-weight models proliferate, scalable, low-latency inference indeed becomes the strategic choke point. Cocoon's design explicitly targets this layer. It is not building or hosting proprietary models, but orchestrating distributed execution of existing ones, initially open source or partner-provided, on contributor GPUs. Cocoon is classically platform-shaped. It owns almost no hardware, incurs minimal capex, and extracts value through protocol-level orchestration and rule setting. The externalization of the means of production via third-party GPUs, remunerated in tokenized claims, ton rewards, mirrors ride-sharing or short-term rental economics almost exactly. This is not accidental. Durov has repeatedly positioned Telegram, ton projects as user-owned alternatives to extractive Silicon Valley platforms. Node operators bear real costs: hardware depreciation, electricity, maintenance, potential regulatory exposure, while the protocol core retains governance authority, incentive redesign rights, and roadmap control. In practice, early Cocoon documentation and Durov's statements suggest a foundation, team-controlled phase before any decentralization of governance, classic crypto pattern. A crucial aspect of Cocoon that further differentiates it from both corporate AI and earlier decentralized compute projects lies in its emphasis on privacy as an infrastructural principle rather than a regulatory afterthought. While much of the debate around alternative AI architectures focuses on cost distribution and ownership of computational capacity, Cocoon's most distinctive technical claim is its reliance on confidential computing, trusted execution environments, full encryption of queries in transit and at rest, and the structural impossibility for node operators to inspect the data they process. In this model, intelligence work becomes opaque not only to corporations but also to the very operators who provide the computational substrate. This is not a marginal technical choice. It directly addresses one of the core asymmetries of corporate AI, the ability of centralized providers to surveil, log, aggregate, and ultimately retrain on user inputs. In corporate systems, even when outputs are privatized, the process of thinking itself remains observable and appropriable. Cocoon, by contrast, aims to sever the link between computation and visibility. Sovereignty here is not merely a question of who owns the machines, but of who can access the semantic content of cognition. Control over intelligence, in this sense, is inseparable from control over surveillance. Cocoon's architecture implicitly recognizes that the power of AI corporations lies less in model weights than in their privileged position as universal observers of global informational labor. Equally important is Cocoon's anchoring within Telegram as a built-in demand source. Unlike most decentralized compute networks, which struggle with the cold start problem of matching supply to meaningful workloads, Cocoon is embedded in a platform with a massive, pre-existing user base. Translation, summarization, moderation, recommendation, and mini-app inference are already being routed through Cocoon-linked infrastructure. This creates a demand flywheel that projects such as Akash, Render, or IO.net have largely failed to achieve, precisely because they lack a native application layer capable of generating continuous, real-world tasks. At the same time, this anchoring reveals a structural ambiguity. While Cocoon disperses computation, Telegram retains the ability to steer demand. By determining which AI services are integrated, prioritized, or monetized, Telegram indirectly shapes which forms of intelligence work become economically viable for node operators. Decentralization of execution thus coexists with a concentration of agenda-setting power. This does not negate the networked character of Cocoon, but it does suggest that its architecture is hybrid rather than purely horizontal, a distributed cognitive substrate organized around a powerful platform nucleus. Placed within the broader landscape of decentralized AI and compute projects, Cocoon occupies a distinct position. Bit-and-Sur experiments with intelligence routing and tokenized evaluation of model contributions. Akash and Golem focus on generalized cloud substitution. Render and similar networks specialize in GPU-intensive workloads. What Cocoon adds to this ecosystem is a specific combination of privacy by design and guaranteed demand. Its competitive edge is not raw efficiency or openness alone, but the integration of confidential computation with a mass-scale communication infrastructure. The risks follow symmetrically. Dependence on the TON ecosystem introduces technical and governance vulnerabilities, while the central role of Telegram raises the possibility of de facto re-centralization at the level of coordination and policy. Yet these risks do not reduce Cocoon to a mere variant of corporate AI. Rather, they situate it in a transitional zone, neither a fully autonomous collective intelligence nor a traditional corporate hierarchy, but an attempt to externalize thinking into a protected network of relations while retaining a strategic center capable of mobilizing scale. Seen in this light, Cocoon is not simply an economic workaround or a speculative crypto instrument. It is an experiment in separating intelligence from observation, cognition from surveillance, and thinking from institutional ownership. Whether this experiment succeeds is an open question. What is clear is that it articulates a fundamentally different answer to the problem of AI power than the corporate model, and does so not through rhetoric, but through architecture. Large Russian projects have rarely been purely economic. Historically, they function as instruments of spatial, political, and civilizational power, even when presented as neutral technologies. Telegram itself exemplifies this pattern, formerly a messenger, substantively a parallel media environment resistant to centralized capture. The move to situate Cocoon within a lineage that includes Telegram itself is extremely effective. These projects are not about direct control or ideological prescription, but about creating permissive environments. Parallel spaces where state or corporate capture is made difficult or impossible. This infrastructure of possibility idea captures something essential about Durov's approach. He rarely builds tools that mandate particular uses. Instead, he builds substrates on which resistant or alternative practices can emerge organically. Telegram became a de facto public sphere in censored environments precisely because it refused to play gatekeeper. The enthusiasm with which Russian bloggers greet reports of the unprofitability of corporate AI is not accidental. It is largely driven by the expectation that networked projects such as Cocoon will demonstrate the possibility of success in artificial intelligence without personal capital investment, without direct financial liability, and without the burdensome task of personnel selection. In the contemporary Russian context, this model is particularly attractive, as it aligns with a broader preference for infrastructural leverage over ownership, responsibility, and long-term institutional commitment. The pattern observed in projects like Telegram and Cocoon, large-scale infrastructures that transcend mere economic rationality to serve as instruments of spatial integration, civilizational assertion, and indirect power, finds one of its most enduring expressions in the nuclear domain. From the Soviet era onward, atomic energy has never been merely a technical or energetic endeavor in Russia. It has functioned as a foundational technology of sovereignty, first as the ultimate deterrent and symbol of parity with the West, later as a vector of exportable order in a multipolar world. The peaceful atom, as Russian doctrine terms it, is not a neutral commodity but a structured offering, a complete socio-technical regime that binds recipient nations into long-term orbits of dependence and alignment. Atomash, the vast manufacturing complex in Volgodonsk, embodies this tradition in material form. Conceived in the 1970s as the pinnacle of Soviet planned industrialization, it was designed for serial production of nuclear reactor vessels on an unprecedented scale. A factory city intended to flood the Cocoon block and beyond with standardized VVER reactors, realizing the dream of atomic energy as the communist future made tangible. Economic miscalculations, bureaucratic delays, and the Chernobyl shadow stalled its ascent. By the 1990s, Atomash had descended into bankruptcy, a relic of overreach amid systemic collapse. Its revival beginning in the 2000s, through integration into Rosatom's machine-building division, Atomenergomash, marks a characteristic post-Soviet reconfiguration, not ideological mobilization but pragmatic reconsolidation under state corporate. Today, Atomash operates as the beating heart of Russia's nuclear export machine, producing the heavy forgings, reactor pressure vessels, steam generators, core barrels, that no other facility in the world matches in volume and precision. This is no ordinary factory. Its output enables Rosatom to maintain its position as the global leader in new reactor construction, with a portfolio spanning Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and persisting pockets of Europe. The plant's rhythmic shipments to India's Kudankulam, Turkey's Akkuyu, Bangladesh's Rupur, Egypt's El Dabar materialize a strategy that is infrastructural in the deepest sense, not direct domination but the creation of enduring technical entanglements. Unlike the permissive, decentralized logic of digital platforms, nuclear infrastructure exercises power through comprehensive vertical integration. Rosatom does not simply sell reactors. It delivers a full lifecycle package: design, construction, financing, often via state loans, fuel fabrication, operational training, spent fuel take-back, and even decommissioning. The build-own-operate (BOO) model, pioneered at Akkuyu in Turkey, is exemplary. Russia retains ownership and operational control for decades, extracting revenue while embedding its standards, specialists, and supply chains into the host nation's energy spine. Fuel dependency is particularly binding. Rosatom controls enrichment capacity and fabricated fuel assemblies tailored to Russian designs, creating a lock-in that competitors struggle to break. Waste management clauses further extend the temporal horizon of influence, as spent fuel returns to Russia, closing the loop. This arrangement is not concealed behind market rhetoric. It is openly positioned as a civilizational alternative, reliable, turnkey energy sovereignty for nations wary of Western conditionalities. Yet its geopolitical yield is unmistakable. Partner states find their energy policy constrained. Hungary's resistance to EU sanctions on Russian nuclear cooperation, Turkey's strategic balancing amid NATO tensions, Egypt's deepening alignment amid regional rivalries. Even where projects falter, Finland's Hanhikivi cancellation post-2022, the sunk costs and partial infrastructures leave traces of influence. In Africa and Central Asia, new agreements proliferate in regimes seeking Russian protection against Western pressure. Extending the gray zone logic into the material substratum of electricity grids, Subversion here operates not through disruption of existing rent structures but through the deliberate reconstruction elsewhere. By underbidding Western vendors, often by 30 to 50% through state subsidies, and offering financing unavailable from commercial markets, Rosatom erodes the post-Fukushima stagnation of competitors like Westinghouse and Framatome. The result is a reordering of global nuclear geography. Russia builds the majority of reactors under construction worldwide, exporting not just megawatts but a model of state-directed technological sovereignty that contrasts sharply with liberalized Western regimes. The elevation of Sergei Kirienko, former CEO of Rosatom, 2005 to 2016, and architect of its global consolidation, into the uppermost tier of the Russian elite reflects the strategic weight assigned to this infrastructural complex. During his tenure, Rosatom transformed from a fragmented post-Soviet inheritance into a vertically integrated behemoth capable of outcompeting all rivals. The international portfolio expanded dramatically. The institutional model was perfected. His subsequent move to first Deputy Chief of Staff in the presidential administration, a position he retains as of 2026. With expanded oversight including domestic policy and post-Soviet space, is no demotion but recognition that nuclear infrastructure has become a core instrument of statecraft, warranting coordination at the highest level. While day-to-day leadership of Rosatom now rests with Alexei Lakachev, and Atomash itself operates under specialized directors within the engineering division, Kirienko's enduring influence testifies to the sector's centrality. Those who master its levers ascend to govern broader horizons of power. In this light, Atomash is less a standalone enterprise than a nodal point in a larger assemblage, one that projects Russian agency across continents through the quiet persistence of steel, uranium, and decades-long contracts. Like earlier infrastructures of the Russian tradition, it creates possibilities not by commanding outcomes but by reshaping the material conditions under which others must act. The peaceful atom, circulated on Russian terms, becomes a durable form of authority in an era when direct coercion grows costlier. If the nuclear complex centered on Atomash represents the Russian infrastructural tradition in its most sophisticated, vertically integrated contemporary form, exporting a complete, decades-spanning socio-technical regime under the banner of the peaceful atom, then Gazprom's transnational gas pipeline network stands as its historical archetype and most visceral expression. From the Soviet era's brotherhood pipelines to the post-Soviet megaprojects like Nord Stream and Power of Siberia, natural gas infrastructure has long functioned as the material backbone of Russian spatial ambition. A technology of integration that binds peripheries to the center through the inexorable flow of energy. Where nuclear exports operate through turnkey plants and life cycle lock-in, pipelines embody a more linear, arterial logic, literal conduits that traverse borders, reshape geographies, and create hierarchies of transit and dependence. Yet the underlying pattern remains consistent. These are never purely economic undertakings. They are instruments for projecting order across contested spaces, securing spheres of influence, and translating resource endowment into enduring authority. The Soviet gas empire began with the 1960s-1980s pipeline boom, Orengoy Uzhhorod, the Brotherhood line through Ukraine, Yamal Europe through Belarus and Poland, and early links to Western Europe. These were framed as contributions to Comcon integration and East-West détente, but substantively served to embed satellite states in Moscow's energy orbit while earning hard currency. The collapse of 1991 fragmented this system, yet Gazprom, carved out as a quasi-state entity under Viktor Chernomyrdan's leadership, quickly reconsolidated it. Under Vladimir Putin's direction from 2000 onward, pipeline strategy became explicitly geopolitical. New routes designed to bypass recalcitrant transit states, Ukraine, Poland, while deepening direct ties to major consumers. Nord Stream 1, 2011, and Nord Stream 2, completed 2021, though never fully operational, exemplified this phase. Direct sub-Baltic links to Germany that marginalized Eastern European intermediaries and split EU. Turk Stream, 2019, performed a similar function in the Black Sea region, securing routes to Turkey and southern Europe. The pivot eastward crystallized in Power of Siberia, 2019, a 3,000-kilometer artery to China that marked the strategic reorientation after Western sanctions. By 2026, the landscape has shifted dramatically yet retains the tradition's resilience. The 2022 sabotage of Nord Stream and Europe's accelerated diversification, capped by the expiration of the Ukraine transit contract at the end of 2024, have curtailed flows to the west. Residual volumes reach Hungary and Slovakia via Turk Stream and lingering Ukrainian routes under ad hoc arrangements, but the European chapter has largely closed. In its place, the Asian vector dominates. Power of Siberia delivers near-capacity volumes to China, while Power of Siberia 2, the Mongolia-routed extension, advances through final negotiations, promising to double export capacity eastward. New agreements in Central Asia and tentative LNG expansions complement the pipeline core. The pipeline model's power differs from nuclear exports in its immediacy and reversibility. Where Rosatom binds partners through irreversible capital commitments and fuel cycles measured in decades, Gazprom historically wielded leverage through volumetric control, threatened or actual shutoffs, Ukraine 2006-2009, Belarus 2004-2010, and pricing disputes that could paralyze economies overnight. Long-term take-or-pay contracts, typically 20 to 30 years, created financial lock-in, buyers committed to purchasing fixed volumes regardless of market conditions, effectively subsidizing Russian infrastructure while exposing themselves to Moscow's discretionary. Transit routes amplified this geometry. By routing gas through intermediary states, Russia could discipline them via revenue shares or cut-off threats, while bypass projects, Nord Streams, Turk Stream, punished non-compliance by rendering transit obsolete. The result was a web of asymmetric dependencies. Consumer nations gained affordable energy, but surrendered strategic autonomy. Transit states gained rents but lived under perpetual renegotiation pressure. Nuclear infrastructure, by contrast, is less susceptible to short-term weaponization. Reactors cannot be turned off without catastrophic consequence, and its influence accrues gradually through technical standards, specialist presence, and waste cycles. Pipelines permit more tactical flexibility but are correspondingly vulnerable to countermeasures, sabotage, sanctions on equipment, e.g., turbines, or demand destruction through renewables and LNG. Europe's post-2022 decoupling demonstrates this fragility, even as the Asian pivot recreates similar entanglements with China on a grander scale. Both systems undermine rival orders by reconstructing rent elsewhere. Nuclear exports erode Western vendors' market share through subsidized pricing and financing. Pipelines historically undercut alternative supply routes, e.g., Nabucco, Southern Corridor, by offering cheaper, more reliable volumes. Yet pipelines achieve subversion more through presence than displacement. Once embedded in a nation's grid, they reshape energy policy for generations, constraining alignment choices, Germany's PRE 2022 Russlandpolitik being the clearest case. Gazprom's leadership mirrors Rosatom's in its proximity to core power. Alexei Miller, CEO since 2001, occupies a position analogous to Kirienko's earlier Rosatom role, long-tenured steward of a strategic asset whose performance directly impacts regime stability. While Miller lacks Kirienko's subsequent elevation to the presidential administration's innermost circle, Gazprom's board and supervisory structures remain densely populated by Siloviki and Putin loyalists, underscoring the sector's centrality. Revenue streams, even diminished in Europe, continue to fund state objectives, from domestic subsidies to foreign policy adventures. In the end, Atomash and Gazprom pipelines are complementary expressions of the same tradition. Material networks that extend Russian agency across space and time. Nuclear infrastructure offers subtler, more durable entanglement, binding partners into a Russian-defined technological future. Pipelines, even in their post-European contraction, retain the capacity for dramatic assertion, now reoriented toward partners less inclined to rapid diversification. Both demonstrate that in the Russian conception, energy is never merely fuel. It is the medium through which sovereignty is circulated, contested, and reaffirmed. Cocoon extends this logic into the domain of artificial intelligence. It is not a directive system. It does not prescribe ideological content or strategic objectives. Instead, it creates a permissive environment, an infrastructure of possibility, within which heterogeneous actors may operate. This indirectness is not a weakness but a defining feature. Power is exercised by enabling forms of action rather than commanding them. The geographical and legal positioning of Cocoon within the gray zones of Central Asia is not incidental. Such spaces are characterized by weak regulatory regimes, overlapping spheres of influence, and limited enforcement capacity. In financial history, offshore zones served a similar function. In maritime history, neutral waters played the same role. Whether or not Cocoon's actual legal entities are literally registered in Central Asia, current public information points more toward UAE, Dubai for Telegram's operational base and a mix of jurisdictions for TUN entities. The broader point stands. Resilient distributed systems require jurisdictions where enforcement is patchy or negotiable. Offshore financial centers, free ports, special economic zones, all perform analogous functions. Parallel between architectural dispersion, decentralized nodes, and juridical dispersion, fragmented sovereignty, is structurally accurate. For distributed AI infrastructure, these zones are essential. Centralized jurisdiction implies vulnerability. A system that seeks resilience must exist where sovereignty is fragmented and enforcement is inconsistent. Cocoon's spatial logic mirrors its architectural one: dispersion as protection. Cocoon does not attack corporate AI systems in any direct or technical sense. It does not hack models, steal weights, or sabotage data centers. Its subversive potential is structural rather than operational. By lowering the cost of inference, redistributing access to computation, and operating outside strict regulatory regimes, it erodes the economic foundations of corporate AI dominance. What is at stake is not expropriation of factories but expropriation of rent. In late capitalism, rent, continuous extraction from controlled access, constitutes the primary source of power. To undermine rent is often more destabilizing than to destroy productive capacity. Cocoon doesn't need to beat frontier labs at their own game, bigger models, better benchmarks. It wins, if it wins, by making high-quality inference so cheap and accessible that the scarcity premium on which corporate AI rent depends begins to evaporate. This is a classic infrastructural undercut strategy. Don't seize the factories, make the toll roads free. In a world where inference pricing is already trending toward commodification, cf. Grok, Together.ai, Fireworks, etc., a truly decentralized, privacy-preserving alternative could accelerate that process dramatically. The geographical dimension of Cocoon also requires a more precise formulation. References to the gray zones of Central Asia capture an important historical intuition: post-Soviet spaces shaped by regulatory ambiguity, cheap energy, and infrastructural improvisation, but they risk overstating territorial fixity. In practice, the operational and legal footprint of the Telegram TUN Cocoon constellation is far more mobile. Dubai functions as a de facto headquarters. Neutral European and Swiss legal structures provide jurisdictional insulation. Validator participation and early node incentives draw heavily from CIS countries. And Southeast Asian infrastructures increasingly serve as supplementary execution environments. This dispersion does not contradict the argument about gray zones, it clarifies it. The gray zone is not a place but a strategy, a moving topology of jurisdictional arbitrage, legal indeterminacy, and infrastructural permissiveness. Cocoon does not emerge from a single territory, but from the ability to traverse and stitch together multiple semi-sovereign environments. This mobility reinforces, rather than dilutes, the political significance of Cocoon's privacy architecture. The emphasis on confidential computing, full encryption of queries, trusted execution environments, and the structural impossibility for node operators to inspect workloads elevates privacy from a consumer-facing feature to a civilizational infrastructure. In environments characterized by censorship, surveillance, or reputational risk, the assurance that even the compute provider cannot observe the content of a request is not merely technical. It is a precondition for certain forms of speech, analysis, and experimentation to occur at all. Just as Telegram's end-to-end encryption re-enabled modes of communication that centralized platforms had rendered impractical, Cocoon's opacity reopens zones of cognitive activity that corporate AI systems implicitly foreclose through logging, moderation, and compliance regimes. In this sense, Cocoon extends Telegram's original wager into the domain of artificial intelligence. Both projects create protected spaces where interaction can proceed without immediate institutional oversight, and where responsibility is displaced from centralized authorities to infrastructural constraints. What is made possible is not anarchy, but latency, a delay between action and capture, between thought and incorporation into systems of governance or extraction. This delay is precisely what centralized AI providers eliminate. By contrast, Cocoon institutionalizes it. At the same time, the essay must avoid over-romanticizing this trajectory as the expression of a singular, Russian infrastructural tradition. While the resonance with post-Soviet practices of workaround, externalization, and indirect control is real, Cocoon is not the product of an isolated national style. Its genealogy is hybrid. It draws on cypherpunk libertarianism and its obsession with trust minimization, on offshore entrepreneurial practices refined across multiple jurisdictions, on Silicon Valley's platform logic of externalizing costs and internalizing coordination, and on crypto-economic experimentation developed in explicitly transnational networks. Durov's own biography, marked by repeated exits, jurisdictional repositioning, and refusal of institutional capture, mirrors this hybridity. Acknowledging this does not weaken the argument, it sharpens it. Cocoon is best understood not as a national project but as a Creole infrastructure, born from Russian encounters with state pressure, refined through Gulf regulatory arbitrage, and scaled through global crypto and developer networks. What unifies these elements is not identity but function. Each contributes to the construction of an environment in which intelligence can circulate without being fully owned, observed, or stabilized by any single institutional actor. Seen this way, Cocoon's challenge to corporate AI is neither purely economic nor purely ideological. It is structural. It proposes an alternative alignment between computation, privacy, jurisdiction, and collective cognition, one that treats opacity not as a defect to be regulated away, but as a necessary condition for thinking under contemporary conditions of surveillance and capture. In the United States, Cocoon is generally perceived as a gray infrastructural risk rather than an existential threat. Confidence rests on continued dominance in frontier models, control over advanced chip supply chains, and the capacity to apply legal and financial pressure when necessary. Distributed inference networks are seen as irritants, not strategic equals. China's perspective is markedly different. Autonomous, non-state-controlled inference networks represent an inherent danger. Within China, such systems are unacceptable. Outside its borders, they may be tolerated instrumentally but never allowed genuine autonomy. Where the American response is complacent, the Chinese response is precautionary. American views treat decentralized inference networks like Cocoon as manageable, gray risks, irritants that can be contained through export controls, e.g., advanced GPUs, CFI-US scrutiny, or selective enforcement against ton-based tokens. The confidence stems from persistent leads in model quality, GPT-5/6 equivalence, fabrication dominance, TSMC nexus, and the soft power of developer ecosystems. China's stance is accurately rendered as precautionary and totalizing. Domestically, any uncontrolled inference fabric is anathema, hence the aggressive integration of AI into the party-state apparatus and the suppression of independent crypto ecosystems post-2020. Externally, gray networks might be instrumentally useful, e.g., for Belt and Road digital projects, but only if ultimately steerable. This asymmetry explains why Cocoon's ton base and Durov's jurisdictional arbitrage evoke more alarm in Beijing than in Washington. From the American perspective, Cocoon is no longer viewed with the near-total indifference that characterized the early 2020s, yet neither is it regarded as a strategic rupture. Since late 2024, the maturation of open-weight frontier models and the proliferation of decentralized compute marketplaces have modestly altered the tone of U.S. policy discourse. Legislative initiatives around the registration of critical AI infrastructure, voluntary reporting regimes for large inference clusters, and expanded scrutiny of cross-border compute flows reflect a growing awareness that intelligence production is becoming harder to localize and regulate. Cocoon, in particular, has intermittently surfaced in State Department and Treasury discussions, primarily due to its potential deployment in sanctioned or semi-sanctioned jurisdictions. Still, this attention remains managerial rather than existential. Cocoon is treated as a proliferation risk to be monitored, contained, or indirectly shaped, not as a structural alternative capable of displacing the corporate AI paradigm itself. The prevailing assumption in Washington is that scale, capital intensity, and regulatory alignment will continue to favor centralized providers, while networked projects will remain marginal, opportunistic, and ultimately subordinate. In this sense, American concern is real but bounded. Cocoon is perceived less as a rival civilization of intelligence than as another instance of diffusion to be governed through export controls, compliance pressure, and selective accommodation. The Chinese response, by contrast, has been more decisive and more revealing. Beijing's posture toward decentralized intelligence infrastructures is shaped by a clear lesson drawn from earlier crypto and mining episodes. Distribution without supervision is not merely inefficient but politically intolerable. Since 2022, China has aggressively dismantled domestic experiments in decentralized computation and inference, while simultaneously building a tightly managed dual structure. On one level, sovereign national champions, Alibaba's Qwen, Baichuan, and similar platforms, serve as elite, centralized intelligence organs aligned with state priorities. On another, edge and cloud hybrids provide distributed functionality, but always within frameworks of visibility, licensing, and control. What China does not permit is genuine autonomy at the network level. Intelligence may be distributed in execution, but never in authority. This distinction is crucial. It highlights why Cocoon remains structurally alien to the Chinese model. Its defining feature is not distribution per se, but opacity, an inability, even in principle, to fully observe and discipline the content of computation. Where the United States tolerates such opacity as a manageable externality, China treats it as an unacceptable breach of sovereignty. These divergent responses illuminate the limits of the religious metaphor sometimes used to describe competing AI regimes, but they also justify its careful extension. If corporate AI represents orthodoxy, a standardized doctrine enforced through institutional authority, then state AI fusions in the United States and China resemble established churches. They differ in theology and governance, but both integrate intelligence production into recognized hierarchies of power, law, and legitimacy. Cocoon-style projects, by contrast, function more like underground sects, lacking formal recognition, dispersed across jurisdictions, and resilient precisely because they do not present a single visible center that can be captured, regulated, or dismantled. This metaphor should not be romanticized. Underground sects are not inherently virtuous, nor are they destined to prevail. Their strength lies in survivability rather than dominance. Cocoon does not threaten corporate AI by outperforming it on benchmarks or replacing it as the default provider for states and enterprises. It threatens it by introducing an alternative mode of intelligence organization, one that is harder to surveil, harder to monopolize, and harder to fully assimilate into existing regimes of control. From this angle, the strategic miscalculation shared by both American and Chinese observers may be similar, despite their differences. By treating Cocoon as either a governance problem or a containment problem, they implicitly assume that the future of AI will be decided at the level of institutions. Cocoon's wager is different. It assumes that the decisive terrain lies at the level of infrastructure, in the conditions under which thinking becomes possible, transmissible, and protectable in a world where observation itself has become a form of power. Is Cocoon destined to win? No, Cocoon is not destined to defeat corporate AI. It is vulnerable to political pressure, internal governance failures, and shifts in global regulation. Yet it is equally unlikely to be fully suppressed. Its strength lies in dispersion, reversibility, and ambiguity. More plausibly, Cocoon will become one layer within a stratified global order of intelligence. Cocoon's vulnerabilities are real, regulatory choke points, e.g., App Store policies limiting ton integration, potential U.S. secondary sanctions on node operators, GPU export controls biting into high-end contributor hardware, governance, incentive misalignments, and technical hurdles, overhead, latency in truly decentralized routing. Yet suppression is equally improbable. The protocol is open, nodes are globally dispersed, and Telegram's user base provides irreducible demand. A stratified order, corporate orthodoxy for high-stakes domains, gray schisms for everyday and resistant uses, feels like the most likely equilibrium. There is, however, an additional risk that must be acknowledged, one that concerns not the failure modes of networked AI itself, but the historical consequences of its failure for entire regions. Participation in contemporary history is no longer guaranteed by demographic size, cultural legacy, or even military capacity. It increasingly depends on the ability of a society to sustain an up-to-date technological regime. Artificial intelligence has become one of the principal thresholds of such relevance. If a project like Cocoon were to fail, if networked AI proved unable to compete with, or meaningfully supplement, corporate and state-centered models, the consequences would not be evenly distributed. Regions that lack the capital concentration, regulatory coherence, or political will to sustain hyperscale corporate AI infrastructures would face a structural risk of technological deactivation. In such a scenario, parts of Europe or Russia could find themselves relegated to a secondary position in global history, not through catastrophe or conquest, but through gradual obsolescence. This possibility is difficult to imagine precisely because it contradicts entrenched assumptions about Europe and Russia as permanent historical actors. Yet history offers no guarantees. Civilizations have repeatedly slipped into marginality not because they collapsed internally, but because they failed to keep pace with shifts in the technical conditions of power. In the age of AI, the inability to maintain access to frontier intelligence systems, or to viable alternatives, would translate into diminished economic autonomy, strategic dependency, and epistemic subordination. From this perspective, Cocoon represents not only an experiment in alternative AI organization, but a high-stakes wager for regions that cannot, or will not, fully commit to the corporate model dominant in the United States and, in a different form, in China. Networked AI functions here as a compensatory strategy, a way to remain technologically relevant without matching the capital intensity, institutional centralization, or political alignment required by hyperscale AI regimes. Failure, therefore, carries a double cost. It would discredit not merely a technical architecture, but a broader attempt to preserve historical agency under conditions of asymmetrical technological development. The risk is not that Cocoon might underperform relative to corporate AI, but that without such experiments, entire regions may lose the capacity to act as producers of intelligence and become mere consumers of externally governed cognition. This reframes the evaluation of networked AI. The question is no longer whether it can outperform corporate systems on benchmarks, but whether it can function as a bridge, however imperfect, that keeps certain societies within the zone of technological contemporaneity. In this light, the gamble of Cocoon is not optional. It is structural. To abstain from such experiments may be safer in the short term, but it carries the longer-term risk of historical disappearance through technical irrelevance. Corporate AI is not a dead end, but it is not the terminal form of artificial intelligence either. It remains indispensable for frontier research, military applications, and high-risk domains requiring massive capital concentration. However, it cannot serve as a universal model for global intelligence. Its centralization, cost structure, and political exposure impose intrinsic limits. The emerging configuration is dual: an elite, corporate state AI sector and a distributed, semi-sovereign inference layer. Cocoon is best understood as a prototype of the latter. Artificial intelligence increasingly exhibits the structural features of religion rather than technology. There is a priesthood of engineers, temples in the form of data centers, mysteries embodied in opaque models, heresies represented by open and gray systems, and eschatologies promised under the name of AGI. In this framework, corporate AI aspires to orthodoxy, centralized interpretation of reason. Projects like Cocoon function as schisms. Historically, it is schism, not orthodoxy, that reshapes civilizations. The central insight of this analysis is not the evaluation of a single project, but the recognition of an epochal shift. Intelligence is no longer a resource that can be monopolized with stability. The struggle is not over who builds the most powerful mind, but over who controls the conditions of its circulation. In this emerging order, power belongs not to those who create intelligence, but to those who govern its distribution. Cocoon is one symptom of this transformation, and symptoms, more than declarations, reveal the direction of history. Corporate AI not a dead end, but not universal. Trillion-dollar training runs, proprietary datasets, and national security integrations remain indispensable, while exposing its limits for ubiquitous, everyday inference. The dual configuration thesis, elite centralized layer plus distributed semi-sovereign layer, feels like the most plausible medium-term future. Cocoon prototypes the second tier, cheap, privacy-preserving, user-aligned inference that can run commodified open-weight models at scale without gatekeeper rent. This mirrors trends already visible by 2026, mixture of experts routing, speculative decoding, and the proliferation of efficient 7B70B models that make centralized hyperscalers less necessary for most consumer and enterprise tasks. Corporate AI does function as aspiring orthodoxy, a priesthood, FANG plus Anthropic, open AI elites, temples, hyperscale campuses in Oregon, Virginia, esoteric rites, scaling laws as scripture, and excommunication for Cocoon and similar gray projects, Bitansa, Akash, even darker torrent-based inference networks, operate as reformations or schisms, decentralizing access to the mysteries, democratizing revelation. That schism, not orthodoxy, often reshapes civilizations is provocative and apt, just as Protestantism fractured Catholic monopoly without destroying Christianity. Distributed inference may fracture corporate hegemony without eliminating it. One further distinction between networked AI and corporate AI concerns the social nature of intelligence itself. Human intelligence is not an isolated faculty but a product of collective relations. Reason emerges only within social exchange, through interaction, conflict, imitation, and mutual recognition. A human being raised outside such exchange, real cases of feral children rather than literary fictions, may retain a human appearance yet lack intelligence in any meaningful sense. Deprived of participation in a collective practice of thinking, such individuals do not acquire thought as a lived process. This anthropological fact has direct theoretical consequences for artificial intelligence. As Georgy Shedrovitsky insisted, thinking is not identical with the biological human subject. Thought can be realized on a human being, but it can also be realized on machines. What matters is not the substrate, but the presence of structured interaction within a system capable of producing and sustaining cognitive operations. From this perspective, the corporate model of AI reproduces the figure of an intellectual Mowgli, a powerful but socially isolated system, trained in a centralized manner, governed by a single institutional will, and largely excluded from genuine reciprocal interaction with other intelligences of its kind. Its intelligence is intensive but inwardly closed. A networked AI architecture, by contrast, introduces the possibility of collective intelligence. Under conditions of sustained interaction, exchange of outputs, mutual correction, competition, cooperation, and differentiation of roles, a distributed network of AI systems may generate forms of reasoning that no single model, however powerful, could reproduce in isolation. Such a collective intelligence need not be superior in all dimensions, nor is it yet clear in which specific parameters it would prevail. But structurally, it occupies a different ontological position. Just as human intelligence presupposes a social field, a networked AI presupposes an environment of interaction. If intelligence is indeed a function of relations rather than a property of isolated entities, then the long-term advantage may lie not with the most powerful corporate model, but with architectures capable of sustaining collective cognitive processes. In this sense, projects oriented toward networked inference do not merely challenge corporate AI economically or politically, they challenge it anthropologically. Corporate AI, for all its parameter scale, remains akin to an isolated subject, trained on vast but static archives, optimized under a single loss function, and deployed in one-to-many fashion without sustained reciprocal interaction with peer intelligences. The intellectual Odonoka formulation is precise and evocative, capturing both the romantic myth of the lone genius and its ultimate sterility. We have no empirical proof yet that distributed multi-agent systems will outperform monolithic models across all domains. But the ontological point stands: if intelligence is constitutively social, then architectures that enable sustained interaction, feedback loops, role differentiation, competitive correction, are not just economically or politically alternative, they are. Cocoon, in this reading, is not merely a cost reduction platform, but a prototype for a different form of cognitive life. This is precisely the point at which the concept of Cocoon acquires its deeper significance. Cocoon should not be understood merely as a distributed inference platform or an alternative economic model for AI computation. At a more fundamental level, it can be read as an attempt to construct an infrastructure for collective thinking in a non-human medium. If intelligence is a social phenomenon rather than an individual property, then the decisive question is not how powerful a single model can become, but whether an environment exists in which multiple intelligent agents can interact in a structured and sustained manner. Cocoon, by design, does not aim to concentrate intelligence in a single corporate instance. Instead, it organizes a field of interaction among heterogeneous computational nodes, models, operators, and tasks. What circulates within this field is not merely computation, but partial judgments, intermediate results, corrections, failures, and successful strategies. In this sense, Cocoon functions less as an AI system than as a cognitive ecology. Individual models within it remain limited, context-bound, and replaceable, but the network as a whole acquires properties that no isolated instance possesses. Just as human intelligence emerges from participation in a social collective, rather than from biological capacity alone, a networked AI architecture allows thinking to be realized not in a machine, but across machines. This sharply distinguishes Cocoon from the corporate paradigm of artificial intelligence. Corporate AI concentrates resources, authority, and epistemic legitimacy within a single institutional subject. Its models resemble intellectual solitaries, immensely capable, yet structurally isolated, deprived of genuine reciprocity with other intelligences, and ultimately confined to the horizon set by their creators. Cocoon, by contrast, externalizes thinking into relations. It does not promise a stronger mind, but a denser field of cognition. From this perspective, the potential superiority of networked AI does not lie in raw performance or benchmark dominance. It lies in the possibility of emergent properties, adaptive coordination, distributed problem decomposition, mutual correction, and forms of collective reasoning that cannot be reduced to the output of any single model. Whether such a collective intelligence will surpass corporate AI in specific domains remains an open empirical question. What is not open is the structural difference. Cocoon embodies an anthropologically informed model of intelligence as a function of interaction, while corporate AI remains committed to an individualistic, pre-social conception of reason. Seen this way, Cocoon is not merely an economic or political challenge to corporate AI. It is an ontological challenge. It proposes a different answer to the question of what intelligence is, and therefore to the question of how power over intelligence should be organized. What circulates, partial judgments, corrections, failures, strategies, evokes a living system of cognition, where intelligence is not stored in any node but enacted across relations. This directly while giving Cocoon a distinctive telos, not to produce a better singleton mind, but to sustain a field in which thinking can occur collectively and continuously. The formulation externalizes thinking into relations. It inverts the corporate paradigm at its root, where OpenAI, Google, Anthropic internalize intelligence within proprietary weights and institutional silos. Cocoon treats intelligence as a protocol-mediated process distributed across replaceable components. This resonates deeply with traditions from activity theory to actor-network theory, yet feels freshly applied to the concrete stakes of 2026 AI infrastructure. The claim is not that Cocoon will be cheaper or more resilient, though it may be, but that it embodies a truer account of what intelligence is. Corporate AI's commitment to an individualistic, pre-social conception of reason is exposed as not just strategically limiting but anthropologically inadequate. This is the deepest cut. It questions the legitimacy of the dominant paradigm at the level of first principles. Cocoon proposes a different organization of cognitive power because it starts from a different conception of cognition. By early 2026, Cocoon no longer exists solely as a theoretical construct. Its initial deployments already exhibit the contours of the cognitive ecology described above. Telegram mini-apps routinely route inference tasks across heterogeneous node hardware, dynamically balancing cost, latency, and availability. Models are swapped not through dramatic architectural revolutions, but through seasonal, almost ecological shifts, from heavier frontier-class systems to lighter mixtures optimized for responsiveness and energy efficiency. Correction occurs implicitly, through user feedback, retry mechanisms, reputation-weighted routing, and gradual task reallocation rather than through centralized retraining cycles. No single node possesses a full picture of the task environment, yet the system as a whole produces outputs that are coherent enough to be socially and economically usable. The confidentiality constraint intensifies this analogy rather than weakening it. Nodes never see the complete semantic context of what they process. Each performs a bounded operation on encrypted inputs and returns a partial contribution to a larger flow. The resemblance to human social cognition is striking. Individuals act on fragmentary information, local signals, and role-specific competencies. Meaning emerges not from total comprehension, but from structured interaction. Cocoon's intelligence is not located anywhere. It is enacted. These early signs do not prove superiority, nor do they guarantee stability. They merely demonstrate feasibility. They show that collective intelligence need not presuppose shared internal representations or centralized epistemic authority. Coordination can arise from protocol-governed exchange among opaque agents. In this sense, Cocoon already embodies, not hypothetically, but operationally, the shift from intelligence as substance to intelligence as relation. Yet the anthropological parallel also demands symmetry in evaluating risks. Collective intelligence has a dark side. Human societies amplify errors as readily as insights. They generate cascades, dogmas, and self-reinforcing distortions. Networked AI architectures inherit these vulnerabilities in technical form. Incentive alignment can homogenize behavior. Adversarial actors can capture reward mechanisms. Localized failures can propagate system-wide. Where corporate AI suffers from isolation-induced brittleness and alignment drift, networked AI risks cascade failures and emergent misbehavior at scale. Neither paradigm is immune to pathology. They are vulnerable in different ways because they embody different anthropologies of intelligence. The advantage of Cocoon is not that it eliminates these dangers, but that it makes them explicit and, in principle, governable. Relational dynamics are no longer an unintended byproduct of scale. They are the primary medium of operation. This transparency at the level of structure, if not at the level of content, creates a new locus for political and economic power. If intelligence is relational, then authority no longer resides primarily in model weights, proprietary datasets, or hyperscale data centers. It migrates to control over the field of interaction, protocol rules, incentive schedules, admission criteria, and routing logic. Power attaches itself to orchestration rather than production. Rent is extracted not from the scarcity of intelligence itself, but from the coordination of the cognitive commons. This returns, in a transformed register, to the platform logic identified at the outset, but stripped of its illusion of neutrality and framed as an explicit political question. Cocoon's significance lies here. It does not promise liberation from power, nor does it herald the end of corporate AI. It reveals that the decisive struggle over artificial intelligence will not be fought over who builds the strongest mind, but over who governs the conditions under which many minds, human and artificial, are allowed to think together. In this sense, Cocoon is less an alternative model of AI than a probe into the future organization of intelligence itself. The foregoing analysis has sought to read Cocoon not as a technical artifact or market entrant, but as a political form, an infrastructural intervention, and, ultimately, an ontological proposal for the organization of collective intelligence in a non-human medium. Yet no such reading can claim exhaustive finality. The project remains in motion, its technical contours evolving, its geopolitical positioning fluid, its long-term cognitive yield uncertain. What follows is not a retraction but a series of calibrations, acknowledgments of complexities, hybridities, and countervailing tendencies that temper the argument without undermining its core thrust. First, the economic and platform logic outlined at the outset requires supplementation on two decisive vectors. Cocoon's reliance on confidential computing, trusted execution environments that encrypt queries end-to-end, rendering even node operators blind to the content they process, adds a dimension absent from purely cost-focused accounts. This is not merely a privacy feature, it constitutes a political guarantee, enabling uses that centralized providers would log, moderate, or refuse outright. It strengthens the claim to sovereignty while aligning Cocoon with a broader civilizational demand for zones of unverifiable thought. Equally, Telegram's billion user base functions as an anchor tenant in a way that pure decentralized marketplaces, Akash, Bitanswer, Render, have struggled to replicate. This creates a demand flywheel but also reintroduces platform power. The core protocol can steer profitable tasks, indirectly shaping node behavior. Comparative positioning thus matters. Against general compute networks, Cocoon's privacy and distribution advantages stand out. Against corporate hyperscalers, its cost and resilience edges remain provisional. The historical placement within a Russian infrastructural tradition, while productive, risks over-essentializing a national style. The gray zone logic, jurisdictional arbitrage in spaces of fragmented sovereignty, holds analytically, yet the empirical geography is broader and more opportunistic than post-Soviet imaginaries alone suggest. Dubai has emerged as the operational center, supplemented by Gulf, Southeast Asian, and European structures. Durov's approach is irreducibly hybrid: cyberpunk libertarianism, offshore entrepreneurialism, and Silicon Valley platform playbook all supply ingredients alongside the Russian inheritance of permissive substrates. The synthesis, not the purity, is what matters. Geopolitical perceptions, too, have shifted in subtle but meaningful ways since the project's public emergence. American complacency has been mildly tempered by 2025-2026 developments. The maturation of open-weight frontier models and the proliferation of decentralized inference clusters have prompted tentative regulatory responses. Proposed reporting requirements, voluntary export control frameworks. Cocoon registers as a proliferation risk rather than existential threat, yet the risk is now named. China's precautionary stance, by contrast, manifests in aggressive domestic containment and selective foreign co-optation. No genuinely autonomous network is tolerated internally, while abroad it may be instrumentalized only under ultimate steerability. The religious metaphor, corporate AI as orthodoxy, networked projects as schism, remains illuminating, yet invites acknowledgement of its limits. The sacralization of technology risks aestheticizing power relations that remain stubbornly material: chip fabs, energy grids, regulatory choke points. The anthropological pivot, intelligence as irreducibly social, realizable only in structured interaction, gains further plausibility from nascent technical practice. Early Cocoon deployments already exhibit ecological traits: tasks routed across heterogeneous hardware, models swapped for efficiency, implicit correction via user feedback and protocol incentives. Confidentiality reinforces the analogy to human sociality. Nodes process opaque signals yet collectively produce coherent cognition. Western resonances, extended mind theories, distributed cognition frameworks, could be invoked to universalize the insight without diluting its Russian methodological inflection. Yet collective intelligence carries its own pathologies, symmetrical to corporate isolation. Human societies demonstrate amplification of errors, adversarial capture, homogenization through conformity. Networked AI will inherit analogous vulnerabilities, cascade failures, incentive-driven groupthink, manipulation at scale. Both paradigms are anthropologically imperfect. The difference lies in which imperfections are made visible and potentially governable. Finally, the ontological challenge: intelligence externalized into relations rather than concentrated in substrates, returns us to power. If thinking is a field phenomenon, then authority migrates from model ownership to protocol orchestration, rule setting, incentive design, access governance. Rent is no longer extracted from scarcity alone, but from the orchestration of abundance. Whether emergent collective properties will manifest: adaptive coordination, distributed decomposition, forms of reasoning irreducible to any singleton, remains empirically open. Superiority in specific domains, robustness under censorship, creative recombination, resistance to single-point failure, is plausible. Universal dominance is not. Cocoon, in the end, does not promise resolution. It poses a question: in an era when intelligence becomes infrastructure, will we organize it as a closed orthodoxy of solitary minds, or as an open ecology of relations? The answer will not be decided by technical benchmarks or market share alone, but by the material and political conditions under which collective thinking, human and non-human, is permitted to occur. The schism is underway. Its outcome, like all genuine historical openings, remains contingent.